Thank you for accessing this episode of The Vault, drawn from more than 4 decades worth of archival material from NYU's New York Institute for the Humanities. For more information on the series or on the Institute, visit our website at NYIHumanities.org. That's one word, NYIHumanities.org. In 1982, the composer Philip Glass presented the NYIH GallatinLecture at NYU. In this episode of The Vault, he discusses his relationship to theater and his turn to working with texts, particularly his work on the opera Satyagraha and his then-forthcoming composition for the film Koyaanisqatsi.
Mr. Glass has had an extraordinary career in American music. He has, among other things, given new life to the opera as a form, first in the work Einstein on the Beach, and more recently, Satyagraha. These operas combine sophisticated technical means with plain and direct expressive ends, a combination which has won Mr. Glass a wide following. Mr. Glass has also experimented with new forms of chamber music. He's managed to make electronic elements in music something more compelling than an oral experiment. He's also had a decisive, if perhaps unintended, influence on punk and new wave music. The range of his work became clear in the extraordinary series of 4 concerts which were recently given at Town Hall. So I'm very delighted to welcome him to speak this evening. I decided to talk mainly about my experiences working in theater. It's something which has always been part of my work and has not perhaps been so well known until the operas that I began doing in 1975 or 76. So that the work I did with the ensemble, which may be how many of you may know me as a performer and as a person with a performing group, I'm not going to really touch on that very much, except to say that group which we began playing together in 68 and 69, and that's still mainly one of the main vehicles for my work. But in many ways, and increasingly, I have thought about the theater, and I thought about the way I've worked with the theater, and about how it came about that I've been working in the theater. Recently, I was thinking about the different roles that a composer has in a theater work. I found that there were about 4 distinct ways that I found that I work, and they tend to come up that way. It has a lot to do with the degree of, let's say, either the degree of authorship or the degree of responsibility that I take in the work. The first way is when I simply am writing music I'm adding music to a theater piece that's already done. And that's how many composers work in the theater, and that's actually I began with the Mabou Minds group, which is a group which is fairly well known in New York now. It was a group that I began working with in 65 before we had that name. The pieces that they did were, first of all, pieces written by the Beckett pieces that they did. That was actually the first work I did with them. And then works that they conceived themselves. In almost all cases that I work with them, I've contributed to a piece that was already done. With something like Dead End Kids or Dressed Like an Egg, these are works by Joanne Akalitis. I would get a script and I would be told in an unreasonable short amount of time when I had to get it done. And I would deliver the tape. And I would go to rehearsals, and usually the time was all very set. And basically, I filled in those spots. That's a fairly conventional way for composers to work in the theater. The second way, which I didn't start doing until I began working with Wilson in 75, was with Einstein on the Beach. In that case, I was really working as a co-author. And that was an intensely interesting, for both of us, a kind of an unusual experience. It was a question of our finding common ground to work in. We had both known each other's work. I think we began working in 74, actually. We spent about a year talking about Einstein as a piece, before we even knew it would be about Einstein. And after that time, the way we began working, we met every week, and we just talked. We had 1 meeting a week on the weeks we were both in New York. And over a period of about a year, we began to develop thematic ideas and structural ideas for the work. That period was actually when we began with the great area of commonality for us was, of course, time. So we began by dividing the piece into time structures. We decided rather arbitrarily that it would be 4 acts, that there would be the interludes, which became known as the knee plays, that there would be dances, that there would be choral parts, There were some considerations that I had to present to Bob that he wasn't aware of. For example, that if the people that were dancing, had to also sing, we had to give them a few minutes to rest in between, which they barely had time to do. There were a lot of practical things that Bob had to get involved with. And then on my side, there were practical things that I had to learn about the way that Bob was designing the piece, the length of time it took to move pieces on and off the stage. All of those things became very useful later on when I did Satyagraha. But in that work, we ended up, it was a truly co-authored work. The first year we spent working together. The second year, when we were actually writing the piece, we spent very little time together. At the point that we had conceived, we knew what the piece was going to be about. We knew how long it was going to be and who would be in it. At that point, Bob began making drawings and I began writing music. And occasionally, I would call Bob up and I would play him some of the music, or he would show me the drawings. The other thing, the interesting thing about the way we did that is that for some reason, we decided that we wouldn't get involved in the other person's area. For example, if Bob did a set design that I didn't particularly like, I didn't say, why don't you change that? Or if he didn't like some of the music, he didn't say anything about that. We had areas that we considered ourselves to be totally involved with and in charge of, and that was that. And there was very little overlapping, though at one point, there was one thing Bob really couldn't stand, and I changed, and there was one thing I really couldn't stand, and he threw it out. So there was a little bit of that, but it was very, very little. For the most part, that year that we spent was more or less showing each other what we were doing. In the third stage of that work, we actually built the piece, and that took place over a period of about 4 months, where the music was written. The sets by that point were all designed, and we began a period of about 3 months in which we were setting what the dancers call we were setting the piece on the actors and the singers. That rehearsal period, we divided every day into 3 parts. We had one music rehearsal, one dance rehearsal, and one staging rehearsal. And we did that for about 4 months. At the end of that time, we had the work really fairly well together, except for the sets. We did a preview of it here in New York, I think at the Video Exchange Theater in West Beth, and then we went to Europe and saw the sets for the first time, which was really a kick for us to see that. And then there was another 2 weeks when we got the whole thing happening. Another unusual thing about that work was that we were doing something which we really didn't know how to do. We weren't an opera company making an opera. We weren't a theater company, really. We were just 2 people who were trying to get other people organized on our project. And as a result, there were a certain amount of difficulties with getting things done on time and things being in the wrong place and that kind of thing. But the thing is that, and of course we lost an enormous amount of money, which everybody knows about that. But the thing is that had we known what we were doing, of course we never would have been able to do it. Or we wouldn't have we known how badly we would end up in a certain financial way, we probably wouldn't have done it. So not knowing that, our innocence kind of saved us in a certain way. For me, it was a kind of a turning point for me. I don't know how it was for Bob. The next work I did, the Satyagraha, the opera, that was commissioned by the Dutch, who asked me if I would write a real opera. It turned out that this would be yet another way of working, which, though I still collaborated with people, and then I think that's the most I think that's the most distinctive thing about theater work, is that it's collaborative in that way, that I would take the lead in it, that I assumed, let's say, the authorship of the work or the responsibility of the work, and that I invited people to work with me. In this case, it was Bob Israel, Richard Rydell, Connie de Jong. And though Richard and Bob were doing the lighting and the sets, and Constance did the lyrics and worked on the book with me, in fact, those roles became very blurred in certain times. There were many times that Bob Israel was involved in discussions of the staging and the setting. The one person missing from that group was the director, and that's been, again, it's been a problem with this kind of work. In this case, I had assumed, in a way, the most responsibility I could, in which that this was really my piece. I hired people to work with me, more or less, or got some other people to hire them. If the work came out well or it came out badly, I was going to take the heat for it one way or the other. I didn't have anyone to share it with, really, except as collaborators. The other way that I found of working, I began doing a series of pieces, of theater music pieces, for collaborators whom I didn't know. I did a piece called a madrigal opera, which has so far had several interpretations. And my idea was that I would write pieces very much the way I would write for a dancer, where I didn't know exactly how the dancer was going to set the work, but often a dancer would say, well, I need a 20-minute piece or a 30-minute piece, or can I use this piece of music or whatever. That I decided, and I never knew what the dancer was going to do or even how it would look. And I thought that this could be done in the theater too. And so I did a theater work. I did a music piece, which I conceived of as a theater work, which had no set story. It had no set design, and it had no It had no collaborator, but it would be a piece that I would invite theater people to complete. So far, it's been done twice. Once in Holland, it was called a taka. The madrigal opera was scored for 6 voices and a violin and a viola. It's not a very hard piece to put on, and that was one of the reasons I did it that way. There, it was set kind of as an autobiographical dance work. It was done in New York and Houston here under the name of the Panther. Now there's going to be a new version of the madrigal opera this summer in Santa Fe. I don't know what it'll be called yet. One of the things I was talking about, the way that I've worked with the opera, and I think it goes back to my first remarks about working with Mabou Mines. The thing that's been, I guess, most interesting about these operas was that I didn't take a play and set it to music, which is how most operas are done. Play is written by the librettist, or sometimes it's adapted from another play, or sometimes it's created from a play, like, for example, Falstaff or something like that. I can say honestly that it never occurred to me to work that way, partly because of the kind of theater people I've worked with. We're in about the 3rd or maybe 4th generation of theater people who don't work out of a literary tradition. This is something that we're very aware of in New York, and we're very aware in this part of New York, I might say, but it's still an idea which hasn't really found, it's an idea which is, for opera people, still a very unusual idea. The first theater that I saw like this, without any doubt, the most influential contemporary theater of my time, of our time, was the Living Theater, which goes back to performances I saw in the late 50s and the early 60s. The Living, as they were called in Europe. They went to live in Europe for a long time. I saw a work, Frankenstein, which must have been about a 6-hour piece, done out of doors, not far from Marseille, I forget. It was a summer theater festival. The Becks, they were doing a theater that was derived from images, from ideas. They didn't start with a play. They didn't start with a written word. It was a work that was a communal activity. It grew out of their working together. There is no doubt that this is a forerunner of the kind of theater that we had growing in the 60s. People like Richard Foreman, Meredith Monk, all these people are still the Mabou Mines, people that are very much around. The idea that theater works could take their inspiration not from a play, but if it were Meredith, it could be, Meredith Monk began, I think, well, she's a composer but also a dancer. It could take its inspiration from movement. In the case of Bob Wilson, his inspiration comes visually. In the case of the performance group, as I know them, though, and the Mabou Mines, it came out of a way of working together. And so that when these groups were doing a work, they were creating a work. They were creating a work from the group itself. The second big influence that we became aware of, and again, this is about I would say the mid-60s, was the work of the Polish Lab Theater. Grotowski was the second very big impetus to this movement. I was in Paris at the time when I think we knew his work there before it got over here. I think I saw it here at Washington Square Church in 1969 or 1970. What he had done was he had taken the physical work, the exercises he had done, and had formalized it so that he had actually developed he had taken something which had started out perhaps as improvisation and had developed into a technique for developing material. Between the Polish Lab Theater and the Living Theater, I know that many of the theater people that I worked with in the 60s were going to France in those summers in the 60s, and there were workshops being done in the south of France. And with Grotowski, this became a very important part of their work. Almost all these theaters, the Schechner Group and the Mabou Mines, were intensely physically oriented groups. In fact, some of the pieces that the Mabou Mines did in 68 and 69, they can't do them anymore because they're too old to do them. They can't roll around on the floor the way they used to. I don't know if they've been videotaped or what. Some of those pieces are just kind of, in a way, they're lost. And it's the way that dancers make dances for particular people. And then you take that work and you put it on somebody else's body, and it just doesn't look the same. When I started working with the theater then, I was involved with these people, so that my way of working with them was to participate in these kinds of creations. When I then worked with Bob, when we began working on Einstein, it didn't at all, I found it not at all unusual to work from drawings, or to work from ideas. When we were working on Einstein, we would begin our discussions with the question, if we were talking about, say, the second scene of the third act or whatever, I would ask Bob, he would ask me, we'd say, where's Einstein? Sometimes he wasn't there. Sometimes he was there. Sometimes he was playing the violin. But we always were looking for Einstein, and sometimes we found him, sometimes we didn't. In a certain way, we were very aware that the audience was going to complete the meaningfulness of the piece in many ways. I think it's Bob's particular talent to be able to evoke images and scenes and theatrical time and situations, which he invites us to complete them in a certain way, that we almost can't resist doing it, that we fill it in somehow. When we began even working on Einstein, and I had gotten the Clark biography, I think, or some other books on it, and I read a bunch of stuff, and I offered Bob the books. He said, no, I don't need to read it. He said, I don't want to know anything that anyone else doesn't know. He said, I just want to know what anyone would know who would be reading the papers. I found that at the time a kind of remarkable idea, but in a certain way, the way the piece developed in terms of the images, it later made a lot of sense to me. I don't think of myself as an opera composer at all. I think of myself as someone who writes operas. Put it another way, the pieces I do fit into opera houses, and I think that's much more accurate. The only reason that Einstein got called an opera at all was that was the only place we could do it. We needed a proscenium stage, we needed theater that had about 30 pipes, we needed fly space, we needed wing space, we needed an orchestra pit. As far as I was concerned, you could put it anywhere you like, but it had to have all that stuff in it. That meant that it had to be in an opera house, and therefore a lot of people just call it an opera. I preferred much more to call it music theater. It happens that opera houses are ideally suited for these kinds of things, and so it's gotten put in that category. The most singular thing that I developed from that, from a musical point of view, was the approach of working with the words as sound, and not to even try to set a text in which the words were supposed to convey the meaning of what we're seeing. Or let's put it this way, in which the meaningfulness of the opera, of the event, was not being conveyed by the content of the words. With Einstein, the solution of using numbers was, of course, a ready one that came easily to mind, and it fit well with the subject. With Satyagraha, picking the Bhagavad Gita, through my reading of Gandhi, and knowing that his intense involvement with that text, he had memorized it, and he had measured all his actions against that, against the moral teachings of the Gita, so that when I was looking for a text, and I knew that I wasn't going to have people singing and telling me what they were doing while they sung, it seemed so unnecessary for them to do it. It even seemed kind of stupid for them to do it. For example, if there's a scene where someone is burning a registration card, for them to actually sing and saying this is what they're doing, I couldn't do it. So then I had to find another text, and the idea of having the Bhagavad Gita, it came to mind because it seemed to me that was something that, and I'm sure that was very much in Gandhi's mind very often, as when you memorize a text, and he had memorized it, sometimes bits and pieces of things are always kind of floating through your mind, almost involuntarily. It seemed to me that was the relationship he had to that material, and that it would make, therefore, an appropriate vehicle for the singers to sing. Then, of course, I had to decide whether to leave it in Sanskrit or Dutch. Well, that wasn't much of a decision. Sanskrit is one of the beautiful vocal languages of the world. Much of the music of South India today, the vocal music is sung in Sanskrit. We hear it in the streets of New York, if you listen for it. Hari Hari, Ram Ram, all that stuff. The book that accompanies the opera contains the historical background of the opera, which was the period that Gandhi spent in South Africa from 1893 to 1914. And he began his nonviolent movement. I wanted that historical period to be known since it was such an unknown period. I've recently done a work based on Hopi Indian prophecies, and I thought I'd play a little bit of that for you tonight. There's something I did for a film. I'm sorry I can't show you the film. It's a film that was, again, it's not unlike the operas that I've done. It's a film that has no characters in it and has no words in it. So it's a film of only images and sound. When the people that were doing the film called me 2 or 3 years ago and asked me if I would ask me to do this film music, and the first thing I said is I don't do film music. And he said, well, this isn't an ordinary film. And of course I'd heard that before. And I said, well, I still don't do it. And he said, well, would I come and see it? And finally he persuaded me to come and look at it. And what I saw were images of America. And I always saw it as a portrait of America. These people are from Santa Fe. They were inspired by Hopi prophecies about the condition of the land of America, of the kind of life we're living. The film, for them, was a way of showing that. It was very interesting to work with this language. I wanted to have a recording of Hopi Indians speaking it, first of all. Then I wanted to have, of course, I had to have that transliterated into English, and I wanted a word-by-word translation of it so I knew what every word was. The next thing I got was I got this cassette in the mail, and it was at first, very difficult to understand what this man was saying, even when I had the English in front of me. The reason I wanted him to read it was I wanted to hear were there natural rhythms in the language that could become part of the music. And I listened for that, and I thought I found it, and then I asked him, was it in fact the case that It was like some Oriental languages. It's a language that breaks down into very small units of meaning, which are syllabic, so that you can combine them and separate them very, very readily. And I asked them whether they could be separated in that way, and they said it didn't matter very much how much they were separated. So then the next thing was I got the singers. I got a group in New York called the Western Wind, and after I'd written the piece, and we recorded it. First, we recorded it. And we recorded it with I set it for pipe organ and for voices. And recorded and I sent it to them. And my big question was whether they would. The thing was I wanted to know was whether they understood it. The curious thing about this kind of endeavor, when you get involved with these strange languages, is that it became very important to me that it was understandable, even though I didn't expect most of my audience to understand it. And that was true of the Sanskrit as well. We very carefully worked on the pronunciation. On a few occasions, I was able to talk to people who did know Sanskrit and told me that they could, in fact, understand when the place where the music was thin enough and that you could hear certain parts come out. For example, at the very end of the opera, where Gandhi is singing at the end. The first place this film was shown, by the way, was taken to the elders of the I don't know how they're organized. Do they have tribes or what? But anyway, these were the people that knew what was happening, the old guys, and they listened to it and they said, yeah, that's it. They said, that's what it sounds like. So I guess I did it right, but I'm going to play it for you. I'm going to play this thing. I'm just playing the end of it. At the very end, the music changes, and they say the word Koyaanisqatsi, and that word is the Hopi word crazy life or out of balance life or the end of life or something like that. And then I was told that it was a word that they used to describe a village when they left it and they would go and build another village. And the film finally took that title, not a very snappy title, but Koyaanisqatsi, try that one. Thank you. Thank you. I was thinking while listening to this, that this whole subject of language and music is something which is intensely interesting to me now. I'm doing a new opera on Akhenaten, the 18th dynasty pharaoh, and the question comes up again about the language. What I've done in this case, I've found text all from the Amarna period, from the period that seemed to fit with the action that I'm portraying. And for the singing parts, I'm looking into the languages of that time through, actually I'm working with some people here at the school. Akkadian is a possibility, ancient Egyptian language is another possibility, ancient Hebrew is another possibility. I may use a number of different languages of that time. I was thinking as I was listening to this, that opera in a way had, from Monteverdi to Wagner, but I think of Wagner as the one that really tied the knot of language and music together, where the modulation would happen on the word that was to be endowed with a special meaning, perhaps. And with Gesualdo, I felt always the same way with his music. There was a knot that they had tied that I felt that oppressed me, that I felt I had to untie for myself. Whether I'll try to retie it again, I don't know. At the moment, I'm still untying. They tied a very good knot, those guys. One of the things that happens that's interesting when that knot gets untied is that music starts to function in a very different way. With this film, for example, the music becomes a container in one way that the images exist in. And in another way, it tells us how to look at what we're seeing. It supplies an emotional content so that the images are no longer neutral. There's such an effect that the music has that in a certain way, if you take in this Koyaanisqatsi film that we did, what we did is that we took out the plot, we took out the characters. And in effect, we took out the words, so all we have really are the images. And then what happens when you view it, the music supplies an emotional point of view to what you're looking at. This is largely true in film, and we're not so aware of it, because there's a much more important foreground of character and plot. But when you subtract those things, and all you've really got are the images and the music, the powerful extent that our way of looking is becomes very clear. It's almost too much in a certain way. Thank you.
This podcast was brought to you by the New York Institute for the Humanities at NYU and the Arthur L. Carter Journalism Institute. You can find us on Stitcher, iTunes, and anywhere else you get your podcasts. For more information, visit us at www.nyihumanities.org.